Morning, everyone. I'm Ron Lang. I'm the Chief Technical Officer of the Construction Innovation Hub. So really pleased to be chairing this session today. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. So first of all, you hopefully got a note pop up as you join to say the session is being recorded. So just be mindful of that when contributing later in the session. Please keep yourselves on mute. I think the powers that be are in control of mute anyway, but just in case, please make sure you are on mute to avoid any feedback or the like. When we get to the Q&A session, a couple of options as per usual with these sessions: either raise your hand virtually or put something in the chat directly. But I would ask if the question is directed at someone specific on our panel, then please do note that so that we get your question answered as efficiently as possible. And then the last thing is please do contribute. We've got a really good group of people here today. It is supposed to be more of a roundtable than it is a panel session. So do get stuck in and involved, and hopefully we can get a good conversation going. So back to the matter at hand. So today's session, we are responding to the launch of a report entitled The Value of Information Management in the Construction and Infrastructure Sector. The report was commissioned by the University of Cambridge's Centre for Digital Built Britain in partnership with KPMG and Atkins, and it forms part of the Construction Innovation Hub's wider sector transformation programme. It's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? But fundamentally, the report addresses two questions. So first of all, how are construction and infrastructure organisations creating, managing and making use of quality and timely information? But perhaps more importantly, what value does this deliver for those organisations as well as their customers, wider society and the economy? Now, for those of you who don't know me, having led prior to this position, the Hub's work on the Value Toolkit for the last 12 months. So I'm really pleased to see the conversation expanding beyond that sort of temporary project domain, and also even beyond the organisation domain, and start to look at recognising the role of information management in tackling some of our broader challenges, both in the UK and beyond. So really pleased to see that conversation broadening out. Anyway, enough from me. So let's introduce our panel. It really is quite an impressive panel today. So thank you for those to join us. So first of all, we've got Richard Threlfall, Partner and Global Head of Infrastructure at KPMG. We've got Richard Robinson, Chief Executive Officer at Atkins. We've got Keith Waller, Programme Director of the Construction Innovation Hub, Alexandra Bolton, Executive Director of the Centre for Digital Built Britain, and Noble Francis, Economics Director for the CPA. So just very quickly in terms of the agenda today, so we'll have a brief presentation from our colleagues in Atkins and KPMG on the report and its findings. And then we'll open up to those panelists to get their sort of elevator pitch really on where they stand, what their perspective is on this particular topic. And of course, then we'll go into a broader Q&A and discussion around those topics. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Chelsea and Will to take you through the report and its key findings.
Thanks, Ron. And can I confirm you can see my screen? Ron, can you? Yeah, we can see it.
Yep.
Nice, that's good. Okay, thanks, Ron, for the intro. By way of introduction of myself, so Chelsea Dosad's a director in KPMG's Infrastructure Advisory Group. I'm an economist by background, and I lead our economics capability within the context of infrastructure. And actually, as really Ron's already touched on, thinking in the broadest sense about the range of benefits that investments in the infrastructure space can deliver for different parties. So I'll let Will introduce himself in a bit, but to kick us off then, just a brief presentation on the report's findings, and then we'll get into a good discussion. So let's see. Great, okay. So to kick us off then, so just I guess to kind of build on Ron's introduction and just recap on the rationale for the study in the first place. So I think we're all familiar with the well-documented productivity challenges that are facing the sector, which ultimately means that building and maintaining the country's built assets costs more and takes longer than it should do. And yet we've got ambitious national policy objectives to build back better, level up the national economy and transition to net zero. And those objectives require two things. They require substantial levels of public and private investment in our built assets, but also secondly, that investment to be more cost effective. And what I mean by that is delivering at a lower cost and better outcomes in terms of the quality and sustainability of our infrastructure. And yet we've seen over the last 10 years a step change in the sector's adoption of information management practices. I think in recognition that access to information of the right quality and at the right time plays a key role in the sector's digital transformation and also ultimately the performance of our built assets. But till this point, there's been limited evidence that looks at the kind of holistic value that's created both within and beyond the sector in terms of using information management. So it was against that background that CDBB posed those two key questions to us, which Ron's already outlined. So how are organisations employing information management practices, considering importantly the use cases for IM at both the organisational level and project level, and then thinking through what value does that create for those organisations, but looking more broadly beyond the organisation to customers, society and the economy. So to respond to those exam questions, we took an approach which really comprised 4 key building blocks. So firstly, as you'd expect, a comprehensive review of the existing literature on the value of information management in the construction and infrastructure sector, and flagging through that review key gaps in the evidence base, and then supplementing or addressing some of those gaps through firstly some bottom-up analysis of 11 real-world case studies, and I'm pleased that we've got many of the stakeholders involved in those case studies that are attending today, and that provides new evidence on the value created by IM at the organisational level and beyond. And then secondly, looking at if we were to assume widespread adoption of IM across the sector, what wider returns would that generate for the UK economy? So taking a top-down economic impact modelling approach, and I'll touch on each of those a bit later. And then finally, throughout the course of work, engaging with key experts from across CDBB and the Hub in terms of formulating and iterating our approach. And so the outcome of that approach really are sort of 3 key outputs I would highlight, and we'll touch on those today. Firstly, it was necessary to develop a bespoke definition of IM within the context of the sector, which captures the use of IM principles at the project level across the life cycle of assets, but also that organisational level lens across functions. And we'll touch on that in a bit. Secondly, what we've termed the information management benefits framework. So based on that literature review and based on that new analytical evidence, we've formed an overall framework to guide future decisions around investing in IM. And then finally, the outcome of all of our analysis has been establishing new qualitative and quantitative evidence on the value that IM can create. And that's aligned to the framework that we set out in the report. And that evidence is set out in sort of 2 key products or reports, which were published on the 16th. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to read. So the main report, as well as really importantly, a case study annex, which actually provides the detailed evidence of that bottom-up analysis. So in the rest of this presentation, we just thought we'd summarise the key outputs of the work and our main findings. So before I go on to the evidence around the value, I'll hand over to Will, who will touch on how we've looked at the use of IM in this study.
Thanks, Chelsea. So a quick introduction for me. I'm Will Squires. I'm a director in our infrastructure business, and I led the Atkins contribution to this work. In terms of background, I have a mixed background in civil engineering and data science, which makes me very interested in this. And I lead a lot of our works around advisory in the technology space in the built environment, and more interestingly, the application of information management and data science to the sector. Now, in defining a definition for information management, sufficient to allow us to sort of get to some of those quantitative and qualitative numbers that Chelsea spoke about and really draw a line around it. This was probably one of the most I don't want to say contentious, but spirited elements of the study. I'm trying to find something that succinctly drew a line around that which was related to use of information management within projects, but also organizations, and didn't stray too far into application of artificial intelligence or silver shots off into the distance. around technology was quite complex. And you can see just this very simple graphic on the side. What we wanted to do was to create something that allowed us to articulate information management as something that supported digital transformation and supported a lot of other ongoing transformation initiatives in the sector. And Ron spoke to the Value Toolkit without encompassing all of its benefits. Now, if you look at previous reports on this sort of an analysis of a benefits perspective, often some of the detail can become muddied and cover all of the benefits, for example, associated with purchasing a drone and replacing a previously manual on-site service, all the way through to visualization of that data in an environment. So the definition we've come up with is an information management improves the quality and availability and timeliness of information related to delivery of the asset, and it facilitates more efficient and effective decisions and investments across the life cycle. And it's a key enabler of digital transformation. Now, we've focused here a lot on the process of information management, the specification, distribution, production, maintenance, storage, archiving, assurance, and data security. And this is meant to be complementary and build on the work of the UK BIM framework, which sets out an approach for implementing BIM in the UK using the framework. If you flick over to the next slide, Chelsea, I'll speak a little bit to some of the detail and some of the examples as to why we felt this information was necessary. So this slide shows the overarching case studies we sort of deep dove into as part of this study. And I actually kind of want to use a bit of a pithy example here. People often talk about the 4 V's of data: volume, variety, velocity, veracity, and sometimes value, which this report is about. Now the important thing about this case study list for us is, first of all, volume. Previous reports, if you look at the PwC report, had 2 case studies, and here we have 11. But interestingly, we also had maybe 30 or 40 different in our shortlist. And actually, this shows the sheer scale of adoption of information management within the sector, and sort of evidences the fact that this is very much a more present and important topic within industry than it was even 5 years ago. The second word here is variety. And what you see here actually is a wonderfully varied set of examples of how organizations have adopted information management. From use of information management to deliver kit of parts home, through to the adoption of the Excel facility with BDP to sort of help solve the COVID crisis. There's a wonderful level of variety here that again shows the different ways organizations are adopting the principles of information management and delivering value from them. The third point here is velocity. And I think one thing we see here in the sector is there's 2 lenses. One is the rate of change is accelerated, and also the rate of change in different organizations is accelerated. What we see again across this case study is some organizations really wholesalely adopting information management and blazing ahead, while as others are very much in the sort of storming phase. But the level of adoption here is what's exciting. And the final point here is veracity when you're talking about data, and hopefully this body of information gives us a little bit more truth to help organizations justify investment in information management. And I won't speak to that for too much longer. Chelsea, if you want to flip to the last slide, then I'll hand back to you. An important thing for us here again was to try move away from a lot of the project or asset or very specific level definitions of information management, and move to some summary categories to capture benefits that spoke to things that a business leader or somebody holding a financial account might speak to more specifically. Now, if you look at the top bin here around asset, project, and program management, this covers the more classical examples of BIM implementation in the capital phase, in the operational phase, and in the estimation and planning phase. And just a note here that we ensured the accounting here accounts for both cost and carbon to keep that simple. The second big bucket of areas we began to see information management delivering benefit was in the financial and commercial functions within businesses, and everything from sort of timesheets and financial reporting through to better cash flow analysis on projects. The third lens, and this is often spoken to in the digital twin space, was sort of looking at organizational planning and response. And we felt there were 2 main buckets to this, one being the longer term strategic and portfolio planning, and the second being shorter term incident management. And finally, we looked at the sort of buckets of risk and audit and compliance as key business levels for driving change. Now, Chelsea, I'll hand back to you and you can perhaps take colleagues through how that maps out into benefits.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, so in summary, this is the information benefits framework that's presented and detailed in our report, and Will's just talked us through the front end of that framework, which is thinking about the different IM use cases within the sector at that organisation as well as project level. And we refer to then the impacts that those use cases can have. So what's the value that drives directly for organisations, which is our sort of second block within the framework, and then looking beyond the organisation to wider stakeholders or beneficiaries from that organisation's use of information management. And kind of the detail under each of these building blocks is detailed in our report. We'll touch on the key points shortly. I think it's important to note that the framework we're presenting is not intended to be a prescriptive methodology for measuring and quantifying the value of information management. As we detail in our report, the individual impact pathways that get you from left to right are highly context specific. There's such a broad range of IM use cases and so many range of outcomes that those use cases can have. But the framework is here to serve as an overview, as Will said, to kind of key decision makers to provide that kind of integrated and consistent basis for thinking through what are the different building blocks of value. And in short, we identify 3 key elements. So as we say here and across the report, really the case for investing in IM is threefold. And firstly, the productivity gains it directly unlocks for those organisations using IM. Secondly, the growth it can drive in the wider economy and ultimately UK GDP. And then finally, thirdly, the social value it can deliver more broadly for customers, society and the environment. And so what I wanted to do was just to touch on each of those 3 categories of value and just pull out some of the headline findings from our main report and then open up for discussion. So firstly, direct value for organisations which use IM through enhanced productivity gains. And through the study, we've identified 3 key drivers or ways in which these productivity gains can come about. So firstly, and I'm at the top left of this slide, from the cost saved or avoided from the use of IM. So IM, through things like increased efficiency, reducing risk, enables organisations to deliver the same or better output for less cost. And that in itself is a productivity gain. Secondly, an alternative form of gain is the ability to increase output or revenue for the same amount of input or effort. So getting more from our assets, the use of IM to then spur innovation and the development of new products and services, driving growth of organisations. And then thirdly, what we've captured here is a sort of catch-all of intangible benefits. So things like reputation and culture, the kind of collaboration and sort of ethos that's created by the use of IM, as well as factors like health and safety of the workforce that are improved through the use of IM. All of those factors can be difficult to measure, but actually once you think them through, they do link to increased productivity in the long run. If you think about reducing the cost of customer complaints, for example, from that improved reputation, or leading to increased demand for an organisation's services, or attracting a highly skilled or retaining a highly skilled workforce within the business, all of those things ultimately contribute to productivity. And through the case studies, we spent a lot of time and effort working with stakeholders to quantify these productivity gains wherever possible. And we were able to do that for around 2/3 of those 11 case studies. And just as we flagged up here, we found that evidence of total cost savings worth between £6.90 and £7.40 for every £1 invested in IM. And we also found, looking specifically at labour productivity, so labour time savings, those returns could be worth between £5.10 and £6 for every £1 invested in IM. And where we weren't able to establish those kind of return on investment multipliers through information or sort of data limitations, we were still able to then quantify the percentage cost savings enabled through the use of IM. and at different stages of the design and construction phases of built assets. And we found quite a broad range, and that is reflective of the range of use cases, and as I said, highly context specific cases in each of those. But those cost savings ranging from 1.6% through to 18%. Devil's in the detail when you look at our report about what those cost savings relate to, hence the wide range. So just a word of caution there. It was more difficult to quantify the cost savings or productivity gains realised in operations, and I think really that's a reflection of two things. Firstly, there was a kind of more limited evidence, kind of monitoring and evaluation evidence post capital handover into operations that says things that were done in the design construction stage leading to savings in operations. There's just a pure lack of information, a sort of data collection of those gains. And then secondly, I think a reflection of the fact that the use cases for IM are more emerging in operations. So actually both the use and value of IM at operation stage is kind of a less established space, so certainly through the existing literature and case studies that we looked at. And I think it's just important to finally flag, I won't go through all of them here, but that there was some, the use of IM alone is not sufficient to secure these productivity gains. There are other important enablers that go alongside the use of IM, and a lot of that comes down to people and leadership. And ultimately, as I've already raised, that point about data collection and a kind of a continuous improvement approach. We can only value what we can measure. So the more we get better at doing that, we'll have a stronger evidence base and case for investing in sort of the next phase or the next range of uses for IM. So secondly, moving on to the area of value in terms of the wider economy. So it's important, as we note throughout our report, that the value of IM is not limited to the organisations that use it, nor the industry alone. The construction sector itself is a very significant, important sector within the wider economy, and it has very strong, what we refer to as kind of upstream and downstream economic linkages with other sectors. So the construction sector buys inputs to produce its outputs in terms of raw materials, professional services, etc. And so if we have a more productive construction sector, and output of the sector increases, it will pull on those inputs and demand more inputs from those other sectors. So there are gains upstream. And then secondly, downstream, the construction sector is pretty unique in that it creates the capital that is then used by all other parts of the economy. So we have other firms and households across all other sectors that rely on the construction sector to produce and consume their own goods and services. And so if we make the construction sector more productive, and that then increases output or brings down prices for those sectors downstream, that too has a kind of ripple effect through the wider economy. And so those two effects together, we captured through our top-down economic impact modelling. So we use what's referred to as a CGE model, that's an in-house model of KPMG's, first time applying it to the construction sector for policies which focus on improving productivity. And that analysis found that for every £1 of direct productivity gain that we generate within the sector, looking at productivity across the design, construction and maintenance of built assets, we could potentially generate a further £3.70 of additional annual UK GDP in the long run, so looking out to 2051. And that's through the ripple effects of that I described there, that translate into wider growth in the economy over time. And it's important that in that £3.70 of GDP, most of those gains are outside of the construction sector itself. So as we've highlighted here, that leads to increased household consumption, increased investment, net exports, and ultimately it means people are being paid better wage elsewhere in the economy. Just a final couple of two implications that also were important coming out of our analysis is that we found, we looked at a range of scenarios. I flagged up the kind of £3.70 return here. We tested, you know, a range of scenarios looking at what if we were to just improve productivity at different stages of the asset life cycle. And we found that overall the GDP gains to the whole economy were greater when we included the maintenance of built assets alongside design and construction. And so really that just underlines the importance of those emerging use cases in operations that I mentioned earlier, and taking that whole life cost approach when thinking about the value that IM can drive. And then just finally, that our analysis assumes that there is widespread uptake of IM, and as a result, widespread productivity gains across the sector, including the long tail of SMEs, which we know in the literature, and I'm sure as everyone's aware here in practice, there are barriers to the adoption of IM for those smaller firms, which needs to be overcome if we're to realise the full extent of these wider economic returns. And then just finally, our third key area of value is that wider social value for customers, society, and the environment. And that wider value comes about by the role that IM plays in enabling higher quality and more sustainable built assets. And this is something which is, this is value which is typically difficult to quantify or measure. And in many cases, it doesn't have a kind of market price like that's traded in the economy, like GDP. We can put a pound figure that's traded, but this still has important public value. There are approaches, indeed government, the way that it appraises infrastructure investments looks very comprehensively at this social value and provides approaches to put pound values on such impacts. The challenge is that within the IM space, this is perhaps kind of not so well established or understood in terms of firstly understanding that link between how IM drives social value, but then secondly, how do you go about actually quantifying and putting a pound value on that public value or social value that's created. So again, lots of details in our report, but two different categories of social value impacts when thinking about this in terms of the role of IM. Firstly, the role of IM can lead to better quality services, as we said, higher quality, more sustainable assets that provides a benefit to the end users of those assets. So less disruption or less downtime of an asset, or more reliable assets to customers ultimately provides them with the benefit. Similarly, if we're able to bring down the costs of the services they receive, that too provides a benefit to end users. But beyond the direct users of infrastructure, there are what we refer to as externalities in the construction and operation of built assets. So when you start to think about the role that IM can play in improving sustainability, for example, bringing down the carbon footprint of our built assets, you know, that clearly those carbon impacts have a wider cost to society, and it's possible to put a value on that. And in a couple of select cases of our case studies, we were able to work with stakeholders to quantify the potential value, social value that IM unlocks. It's important to note that this is a particularly difficult area to isolate the specific role of IM versus other factors. But the analysis does demonstrate that relatively modest investments in IM can generate substantial benefits in terms of social value. And just finally, though, I think a key implication, or a couple of key implications from the work, is that firstly, as I've said, this is an area that is perhaps not so well understood by organisations. Typically, we found organisations weren't necessarily thinking from the outset about this social value and building that into the kind of investment case for IM. And if it was being done, it was more focused on the metrics that could have a more direct financial implication for the organisation, rather than thinking about social value in its broadest sense, even if it ultimately has no direct bearing on the organisation's operations. And then secondly, as I've already alluded to, that whilst there are methods that exist for putting pound values on these types of impacts, they're relatively complex, require a specialist set of skills, and that doesn't necessarily sit within the toolkit of IM teams, IM practitioners. So if we are to get people thinking about this, we need to think about the skills that are needed at that kind of investment case stage to truly capture the full range of impacts in terms of social value and attempt to quantify and value them as far as possible. So that's a very quick canter through, lots to take in, I appreciate. That brings us to the end of the presentation. I'll hand back to, I think, Ron, who will take us through to the panel.
Great stuff. Thanks both for that. So I think clearly you can see from the presentation there, really would employ you to go and read the report. From my perspective, two things. One is that clearly the findings themselves are interesting and worthy of further debate, as we will do today, but also methodologically speaking, huge amount of rigor behind how that work was done. So for those geeks among us who want to go and look at that aspect, I'll really strongly encourage you to do so. So without further ado then, what we're going to do is I think we're just going to go to each of the panel members very quickly just to give their perspective on how they relate to this work, how they relate to the findings, and I suppose anything they found surprising or confirming. And then we'll open up to broader questions. So if I just quickly shoot out to each one of you. So Richard Threlfall, if you can give us your perspective neatly, I suppose, from one KPMG to another.
Ron, thank you very much indeed. I mean, I really do think this is a seminal report, as I think I said on social media when I shared it when it was published, and I'm really proud of the fact that KPMG been involved with it, and Chelsea and Will, thank you very much for your leadership of it and the presentation this morning. Chelsea, you framed the work at the beginning in the context of the UK's infrastructure challenges, building back better, levelling up, net zero. But these are not just the UK's infrastructure challenges, these are the world's infrastructure challenges. And the thing that I think is really exciting about this report for me is that its applicability, as far as I can see, expands across the whole world. And it sort of takes us back to some fundamentals about what infrastructure and construction is all about. It is about building the foundation of civilization and investing in a country's future. Infrastructure is, as some of you will have picked up before, responsible in some shape or form for the delivery of about 92% of the underlying indicators of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. It is also the solution to something between 70 and 80% of the world's carbon emissions. So for all of these reasons, I guess everyone around this virtual table understands that infrastructure is sort of fundamentally important. But equally, we all know that our ability to deliver that infrastructure and maintain it and operate it effectively is severely constrained and always has been. The estimates vary, 70, 80 trillion, however much it is. It's a vast sum of money that outstrips the ability of both governments and private investors to bring that money to the table. And COVID has in particular hit the ability of developing market governments in particular to make the investments that they had planned. And for all of these reasons, anything that drives greater efficiency in the delivery of construction and infrastructure is the most fundamental route to getting more output for the input that is capable of being put in. You referenced again, Chelsea, the poor productivity record of the industry. Again, it's not just a UK story. I remember a few years ago, the Hong Kong government reckoned that productivity in that territory had actually fallen over the last 20 years because construction has been the last industry to really embrace what is possible in terms of data, information management, and technology more generally. Of course, it was more than 5 years ago now that McKinsey provoked the industry by saying that it was probably spending 40% more than it needed to because of the failure to embrace the role of data in the industry. I prefer to turn the maths of that around. We don't need to spend less on our infrastructure. We need to get more infrastructure out. You turn it round, you make that 40% efficiency. You can deliver 66% more infrastructure for the money that is available. And for me, that is fundamentally what this report is all about. It is, in a sense, a long overdue wake-up call to the importance of embedding information management across the fragmented industry that is the construction supply chain. And I think it's hugely exciting because I hope that it will inspire not just the players within that supply chain, but also government to think more creatively about the way in which they create the structures that really bring information management to the heart of how the industry operates. And ultimately, that means that we will be able to attain the UN Sustainable Development Goals, perhaps not quite so far beyond the 2030 timeframe that's currently envisaged. And it means that we will be able to invest at the rate we need to in order to deliver net zero. And it means that we will be able to drive all the productivity and knock-on GDP benefits that you mentioned, Chelsea, for the benefit of not just the UK, but every country in the world.
Thanks, Richard. That's a rousing start to discussion. Richard Robinson, go and move on to you, please.
Thanks, Ron, and thanks, Richard, for those great points there, and then several of which I'll no doubt echo. And good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be in the presence of so many digital gurus in our industry, looking at many of the names on here. So it really is great to have everyone on. Look, I think there are three key things from the report that really stand out as important to me for the industry as a whole. Firstly, it's a really, really important piece of work. There's almost no data like this currently available on the value of information management to delivery. And I think this has made financial investment cases in digital, in IM, really hard for companies to justify, for companies large and small to justify. Try and get in that past your FD or your CFO if you can't show a returns case. And I think that's no doubt held back investment in digital in the industry. So I think this study will really enable business cases and lead to faster paced investment in IM and digital. And that will drive us forward on digital transformation of the industry. So I think this work's really key for business leaders. And I don't think this is 100% true, but there's a large amount of truth to it there. But if it's not real, if you can't point to those efficiencies and those reduced costs in your profit and loss account, in your P&L, then those numbers aren't real. So I think the discipline and rigor that Chelsea certainly took us through there at the start that's gone into this report are really important. Many previous studies, haven't they, have been quite often at practitioner level, and we might a few years ago might well have been listening to a report like this about the benefits of clash detection in BIM, and those are really, those elements are really important. But I think that didn't really readily translate into pound improvement in productivity. So I'm really pleased that this report's sought to take all of that up a level and see it from a business and industry and global perspective, as Richard outlined. Secondly, the report's based on real world examples. So the returns case that we've seen, I think, is real. As Will talked about, adoption is going up rapidly. But as you can see from the case studies in the report, even just the 11, and that was brought down from a good 50. That there's quite a variation in how companies are going about adopting digital. I'd encourage you to have a read of the report. I'm sure you have, but there are some really interesting things, aren't there, in how information management enabled rapid deployment of the Nightingale hospitals. Edaroth, our own business here in Atkins, is a construction company created in a digital environment. We haven't had to do anything to sort of shoehorn a business into a digital environment. We created that business fully digitally enabled, which is already reaping some interesting benefits. And CPS, I think, is a fantastic real world example of operating the country's busiest motorway, and how using information management will really reap benefits for the company running it, will reap benefits for road users, will reap benefits for Highways England. So I think I just really like the real world value creation that we can see in there. Thirdly, the ROI is exceptionally positive. £6 of productivity value created for every £1 in IM. That is a fantastic number. We're not talking about something that's, if you've done business cases for public sector projects before, you'll know those sort of fine margin multiples that we argue about. But 6 to 1 is inarguable, isn't it? Even if we're out by a factor of 2, it's still massively worthwhile doing. And the wider impact, I think, if Chelsea will probably be horrified at my application of economics here, but if you multiply a couple of things together there, you can see a wider impact of a leverage of 20 times, can't you, 20-fold on any investment in information management. You know, and that's the wider business impact from higher order technologies once we've got information management sorted out. You know, and this doesn't surprise me actually in many ways, as I'm sure many companies have done. In Atkins, we implemented IM a number of years ago, and only now have we really been able to enable the higher order solutions like machine learning and AI and the applicability of those, because we started that journey a while ago. And we weren't seeing these numbers a few years ago, I don't think, and it makes you wonder, doesn't it, if there's some higher order Moore's law at work, and that we will drive out greater efficiencies when we redo this study in 2, 3, 4, 5 years time, that we'll find that leverage in IM was an order of magnitude higher than we even thought. And I think another thing that we weren't seeing a number of, even just 2 or 3 years ago, is the presence in C-suite discussions of information management and digital. That's something we talk about in my exec meetings, every single exec meeting. There are infinite numbers of roles advertised now in information management or projects. And I think that's just a fantastic trend, and it shows that transformation is taking place, and you can see it through many of the things in this report. Look, so what's a key takeaway for me? I think actually overall the government's role in supporting information management is just beginning. I think we made a fantastic start as a country with the BIM mandate back in 2011, with implementation in 2016. I think we need to drive forward and make that become the IM mandate, and work that as hard as we can through the country. We've got a great foundation in the construction playbook to work from. I think it's super important in keeping the competitive advantage of UK PLCs, to use that hard-worn phrase. And I think finally we need to decide who will be the guardian of all the data. Interestingly, we've created a national data guardian for healthcare. I think we possibly need one of those for the built environment, and we need to make sure that open data is used for the public good. All these things are in the report, and I think it's a fantastic piece of work, and I'm really pleased to see what's come out of it.
Which is some really key points there, I think, from my perspective as well, things I've been thinking about. Keith, we can turn to you. I'm going to tell you to try and speed us back up again, get us back on track, I guess, which is never something I ask you to do normally, Keith, but see how you go.
You're destined to fail, Ron. Thanks, Ron, and to the two, Rich, particularly to Chelsea and Will for leading this work. And I think perhaps I'd like to echo the points made by the previous speakers. Now, when I first read the draft for this a couple of months ago, I was particularly struck by the analysis that set out evidence, not just of the direct benefits to businesses investing in IM and to the projects and programs that they're delivering, but also those indirect benefits, how IM could support those broader social and environmental outcomes, something that the Hub's value toolkit is very much focused on. And of course, the multiplier effect, delivering benefits to the wider economy, not just constrained within our sector. So there's something in this report for everyone, for policymakers, for clients, for businesses, for users, and for society at large. But the report does raise some challenges. For example, how on average, and with some notable exceptions, SMEs are much less likely to be investing in technology adaptation than larger organisations, and are overall around 20% less productive, which is a crucial factor in a sector of our size with such a long tail. So it seems really, as far as IM goes, size still matters. So if we're to realise the full benefits that are set out in this report, and we surely must, then government and industry must ensure that the opportunities are not just felt by those large multinational organisations, but by all parts of the sector. So there's a key role for government to champion investment in IM. It has history from the 2011 BIM mandate, and particularly thinking about how construction and infrastructure will be driving our post-COVID recovery plans. Government's got ambitious plans for investment in construction infrastructure, and it's shortly going to be publishing its national infrastructure and construction pipeline, and later this year will set out its spending plans. So this is a moment of opportunity. So government will always be our sector's largest clients. So it's crucial that, as well as being the largest, they also act as our leading client, setting the strategic direction for our sector. It's a complex policy environment, but there's real opportunity with both the ambition of the construction playbook and the forthcoming iteration of TIP to push this agenda harder and faster. But industry can't just be passive. It must also really play its part, working with clients, departments, policymakers to speed adoption. And as Richard Threlfall says, getting it right here will open up global markets for UK businesses. So this report really sets out the case for IN clearly and with evidence, crucial as Richard Robinson said. And our challenge is to make sure we build on this analysis to drive real transformation, not just in the direct benefits described in the report, but those crucial indirect areas, social value, carbon, the wider GDP, that a sector of our size can really unlock. So I wholeheartedly welcome this report. Its publication isn't job finished, it's job started. Thanks, Rob.
Excellent, Keith. Thank you very much. Alexandra, let's turn to you now, please.
Good morning. Thank you, Ron. I was really excited to read this report. When I first stepped into CDBB, one of the questions that I was asked constantly was, why should I use information? Why should I use BIM? What's in it for me? How do I explain this to my C-suite? We need to be able to answer those questions if we're going to be able to build the capacity in both the public and private sector to use information management. And this report does that. So huge thank you to Chelsea and Will and the team. You would think that information management, so having the right data at the right time in the right hands, and that information is right, it feels like a no-brainer. And to date, we've had qualitative evidence, the pandemic being a classic. You can just look around at enterprises in construction and outside, and those who've done well out of the last few years, those who've managed to hold their own and to pivot quickly, have been those who've embraced digital transformation. And we've had the previous PwC work, which provided the foundation, but this evidence-based with real case studies makes that point. It allows us to answer that question. What's in it for me? Why do I use information management? And how do I explain it to my C-suite? So really excited to see this. Also, there's the extra work around the vision for the built environment, which some of you may have read recently, talking about how do we use our infrastructure for a better future for people and the planet. Those intangibles that Chelsea started to talk about, where we can quantify them, but they're also the unquantifiable bits of the social benefit, bits of the environmental benefit that are also gained when we use information management. And beyond that, when we go into digital transformation, or as I would probably call it, the cyber-physical fabric, when we're looking at AI and machine learning, and we're looking at robotics, how they all fit in. And it's worth noting that this report doesn't project into future technologies or really outside the construction sector. And we know that that is additional value that we're getting from information management. So for example, connected ecosystems of digital twins will expand the ratios that we get. I'm really excited to see for the next phase of this report in 2, 3, 4 years time, when we bring in those technologies, just how much benefit we will be getting out of our information management in the future. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. And last but by no means least, Noble, please.
Thank you very much. And as all the other speakers have said, thanks to Chelsea and to Will for the report, which is a fascinating report. Each time I get an invite to a committee, a group, a work stream, a new publication, and this industry is full of them, constantly being churned out, I generally say no, but this is one of the few that I've actually said yes to, because I think it is a seminal report, as Richard highlighted earlier, and I think there are some vital points to this that could change things massively for the future. There's a tremendous opportunity here, not just the scale of what needs to be done in terms of construction through net zero and levelling up, as speakers have mentioned earlier, but also building 300,000 homes a year, £600 billion infrastructure pipeline, and not just the quantity of what needs to be done, but the quality as well. And if we're going to achieve this, we're not going to be able to do it in the same way as we've done before, because the scale is so great. What the report clearly highlights are the benefits of embedding technological, cultural, information management, these structural shifts that we're going to need to make, what the benefits of those are. And it's going to be particularly vital for the supply chain, as Keith mentioned briefly, which, if you look at construction as an industry, the main contractors and main house builders aren't the majority of the industry. 86% of employment within construction is the SMEs. And if we're going to get information management throughout the supply chain embedded, we're going to have to get it through to the SMEs, who are the ones that have the least finance available and the ones who find it difficult to adopt technology en masse. Now, I come from a part of the industry, which is construction product manufacturers, who already use information management quite considerably. It tends to be easier for them because they're a relatively few number of firms within a product sector. They're making a generic product. But for them, information management is absolutely vital and it's justifiable. They're making very large upfront investments of £100 million or more for a long-term rate of return. So they need to know that that is justifiable. They need to know what the rate of return is, both on the initial cost, the operational cost, the improvements in efficiency, the reductions in defects, etc. And all these are sorts of issues that are highlighted in the report that need to become embedded within the whole construction supply chain. The report also has some excellent facets that tend to be missed out in most of these reports, committees, work streams that I'm invited to be a part of. It doesn't just focus on productivity, it highlights the benefits in terms of reductions in risk, in terms of increases in quality, improved health and safety and reputation within the industry. And it also highlights benefits to social value. So from my perspective, it's an absolutely vital report. And I think it does have the power to change things for the better and incentivize major investments in all the key areas, whether it's offsite, whether it's technology in terms of digitalization, but also within cultural change. Thanks.
Thanks, Noble. So we've got around 15 minutes or so to open this debate up, this conversation up. So we've had a first question I'll go straight to. So Martin Gooch from BIM for Water asks, and perhaps this is one you can answer, Alexandra, what are the plans for this report going forwards? How will it be used across the sectors to promote IM and to speed up the momentum of IM being adopted more fully across organisations? So maybe turn to you first and feel free to pass on as required.
So I think how will it be used going forward? It's done one of the things we'd really hoped it would do, which is to make that business case. So those conversations where we're talking about why should I use information management? It's here. It shows in a quantitative sense. For every pound you put in, this is what you will get out, and that is a fantastic outcome, and is already been picked up. I would hope that this would become a report that is run every 3 years, every 5 years, by a centre of excellence that's looking at information management and digital transformation within the built environment. We need to wait to see how this is received and look at how government is picking up information management over the next few years to see exactly how we need to position that report, because undoubtedly new technologies will come on board, and which of those do we include in that report. But I would hope it will be part of a continuing series of reports as we measure ourselves as an industry, as a sector, to make sure that we are doing the best we can with our infrastructure for that future we want for people and the planet.
Excellent, thank you. I think it certainly seems to be appetite, certainly among the panel and others, about making this not just a one-off report and making sure we've now got a methodology for how we look at this in the longer term. So certainly it's my hope that we move in that direction. I think, again, picking up on a number of comments that people made in the sort of opening pitches, what would we say, and again, I'll open us up to anyone who wants to answer it, but what key policies or investment do you think government needs to make to help accelerate information management and take up in the construction sector, and especially picking up on what a number of you have said around SMEs? So what more can the government do to help us on this journey? Does anyone want to take that one?
Can I have a pop, please, Ron? So I think there's probably a case to say that they've already started thinking about this. Now, what we saw in December last year with the publication of the construction playbook, and don't forget that was a policy intervention by government that was very much developed with industry rather than something that was done to industries. There was a lot of industry involvement in drafting that, in shaping it, in getting the focus in there. And there is a big focus on the importance of information management in that construction playbook. And of course, you know, we've said, I think I said in my remarks that one of the challenges I think many government departments are facing at the moment, many government clients, is they're operating in an incredibly complex policy environment. They've been asked to drive a path to net zero, to improve social value, to think about whole life performance. And really information management is something that can help measure and deliver against all of that. So I expect to see, building on the publication of the construction playbook, the implementation of the construction playbook, and forthcoming policy documents that government will put out, like transforming infrastructure performance and others, start to put that focus in and put some tangible action in there. I think the evidence in this report is really helpful to build that case with government and with policymakers to sort of drive that change. I think what's missing or not visible at the moment is how we're going to get that focus right, so it doesn't just work for Atkins and KPMG, but it works for that long tail of the industry as well, because we're not going to deliver all of the benefits that are potential from this report unless we're focusing on the whole of the sector and finding the right interventions that make it work with SMEs, not just the big boys.
And if I was just to build on what Keith just said, Ron, that challenge of how we draw the whole of the industry together through that long supply chain tail that Keith referred to is absolutely fundamental to this. And in the same logic that underpinned the Project 13 initiative, I think there's a disproportionate onus on the largest procurers and operators and owners of infrastructure, whether they're public or private sector, to take a lead and then to draw the supply chain with them. And in that respect, when we come back to the role of government, I think it's important to recognise that government has two powerful levers. They're both the policymaker, who can set the frameworks within which the industry operates, but perhaps more importantly, they're a major procurer in their own right. And they can set an example, they can set a best practice example, as indeed, in fairness, the UK government has done over recent years in terms of its adoption of BIM and its adoption of off-site manufacturing as a presumption. This report, to me, is the evidence base to encourage government to recognise that they have a similar role to play around information management more generally.
Just a couple points I'd love to raise, building on the conversation, from some of the challenges I guess we faced when actually putting the work together. One of them was when we were drawing a definition of the sector, and it speaks to both your points. How do we draw a line around the technology companies that are increasingly becoming a part of delivery in this space? And I think you could similarly ask from a policy perspective, Keith, you quite rightly mentioned TIP, the construction playbook and other things, but one of the things that interests me, and CDBB are doing a lot of this work wonderfully with the Turing Institute, is how do we link to the National AI Strategy, the National Data Strategy, and really start to take advantage of some of the impacts technology can have in the industry? And Richard, I go back to your sort of point of the clarion call from the McKinsey report, or the slap across the wrist, if you want to call it that. But I think that how we recognize how we bring other parties and SMEs into our industry is really critical to realizing a lot of this benefit.
Thanks, Will. So moving on to a slightly different question. Mark Enns has asked, picking up on Richard R's comment about the need for a centre, how can we connect and coordinate on this agenda going forwards? Do we need to establish a visible focus or leadership for data, digital IM across the industry, and where should it sit?
I'll take that if I might, Ron. And I'm not going to answer the where should it sit, because I think that there are a number of places that if the right vehicle could be created, it could sit. But I think it is vital to have a coordinated approach to data, to digital, to information management, and more broadly to this cyber physical fabric, to connected digital twins. Otherwise, we will end up with a very fragmented industry. And I like Mark's phrase of connect and coordinate. It is about that collaborative approach. It can't be a command and control. We need to have a tech agnostic, fair broker to hold this space and to coordinate, collaborate, talk with the industry, with the end users, but also with people, because information management, it has information in there. We need to make sure that society is happy with how we're using it and how it's being used, stored, shared. It's really important, I think, that government thinks about what vehicle it wants to have to look after this work on behalf of the nation.
Yeah, absolutely. Did anyone else want to comment on that, or do we want to move to the next question? Chelsea, there was a definite shake of the head there, so welcome to you. So next question from Matt Peck. Will you be publishing this study method? Probably this is aimed at you, Chelsea and Will. I lead the Atkins team working with CPS, and my client would like to build on this study and repeat the analysis for further business areas. There's so much potential here, and publishing the method will help us to realise it. Great question.
It is a good question, and actually it's sort of it's an area of debate we had at the start of the study, I guess, about how much could we feasibly kind of cover within the study. So do we go down that, as we have done, providing an overall framework, but then leave the detailed methodology, because it's so context specific, to individual practitioners, or to go down the route of a more prescriptive methodology? We have, as I say, gone with the former, and the reason being, as I sort of said earlier, is how context specific each IM use case is, and then how that translates through into a particular type of cost saving or increased output in terms of direct productivity gains, but even then more specifically the social value it drives. So I guess it's something we can certainly just discuss with CDBB, but it's not something that's kind of a core part of the plan of publishing this study, only because there are real risks involved with a kind of an assumption of being able to lift and drop an approach, because that's not really the case here. I mean, that's the difficulty in all of this, right? If you look at our summary framework, we've kind of probably got about 20 different building blocks to the framework, but actually as you start to unpack the individual impact pathways, you start to multiply out the different ways in which those productivity gains or wider social value could come about. And so then it is very hard to say that there's one set of approach for every practitioner out there. So that's the kind of practical challenge, I guess, we have in publishing something as though it were a rule of thumb for every future kind of IM investment case out there.
Thanks, Chelsea. That seems to have sparked some debate. Neil Thompson and Henry Van Taylor have got their hands up. Can I come to you, Neil?
Yeah, thank you. One of the things when starting this work we debated about was, how do we draw that boundary around the industry, and we picked the statistical definition of construction. I wondered, it is to everyone, but maybe Noble first, in terms of, we can generate all this value, but if we look at how value is generated from a pound and pence perspective, we essentially might have leakage. So we have the parts of our industry that are doing lots of work around generating that value, but where it gets captured and who's generating it is slightly different. I was wondering if you can expand on that.
Yes, thanks, Neil. If you look at the official definition that is used in the standard industry classifications, then construction is covered purely from the contractor's perspective. And so it's a relatively narrow definition that doesn't include the architects, cost consultants, builders, merchants, plant hire, tool hire. So construction is a very, very broad industry, but it's a very complex industry that crosses over lots of different standard industry classifications. For instance, if you have something, an infrastructure that is being built by Skanska, then it's covered within the SIC codes for construction. If it's Bechtel that's building it, then it won't be, because they're an engineering firm. So it's a very complex area to cover from a statistical point of view. But I think what's important, and this is what's very good about the report, is that it's covered things in a very robust manner. It hasn't tried to be all-encompassing, but get very vague in terms of areas that it's covering. It's very clear, very specific, and it's tried to be as robust as possible. And I think that's what's excellent about it. And I think that's why I think it will be a seminal report going forward, and a piece of research from which other pieces of research will be established. And I think, given how complex construction is to measure, I think this report's done an incredible job of covering the benefits from lots of different aspects, but being very clear and specific and robust about it.
Thanks, Noble. Thanks for the question, Neil. Henry, your hand's down again.
It is down, but I still have things to say. I thought I'd put it down so to rest my hand, as it were.
Okay, would you like to take this opportunity?
I would, thank you. I think building on these previous points, what I liked, and we discussed this while the report was in draft, was around that definition of information management. And I think segregating it out from all digital innovation really shows how it's an underpinning process of managing information. I think that's the key differentiator for me that makes this stand up, because if it had just been BIM or a wider definition, I think it would have fallen down, simply because a lot of professionals, a lot of disciplines, a lot of organizations would have been able to say, well, it doesn't include this, or it didn't look at that. By focusing on information management, it feels to me like it's enabling that managing with data. So maybe later in the day, we can deal with this complexity because we have data that we can use in the management to show this is the work that has been done, this is its progress, this is who has it, this is the provenance, which is something that is quite emergent, I would say.
Thanks, Henry. That's fine. I don't mind a statement. Another question from Martin, either for Chelsea or for Will to dip into. So the case studies show a wide range of savings, 1.6 to 18%. Was there some clear difference between the case studies with regards to how they achieved higher returns, or others much lower? And are there any lessons to learn?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start, but by all means, add Will. I think, so a word of caution, I guess, as I sort of flag devil's in the detail about when making comparisons across the case studies. So the range of 1.6 to 18% is actually somewhat distorted by the very top end being a one-off of 18%. And then at the bottom end, we kind of have low single digit. So it's kind of 1.6% up to around 3% from memory. We have a slight outlier of 18%. And that's because rather than looking at cost savings on a total cost basis, it was specifically around design costs. So it's a very sort of technocrat's response, which is that the denominator is different for the 18% than it is for the other cost savings. So the other cost savings are more around the kind of 1 to 3% mark. And those reflect very different types of IM use cases and different types of built assets. So from buildings through to a tram extension, but are all around that, as I say, 1 to 3%. That 18 is a slight outlier. I think it's worth having a look at the section 6 of our main report, and we explain in more detail what each of those cost savings represent.
Chelsea, Will, did you have anything to add there?
I think Chelsea has always covered it very thoroughly and very succinctly and with great rigor, which is something that's been complimented extensively today. But I think for me, I'd just go back to those points before about variety that I made. Actually, we have, for example, I believe Simon White's on the call, the organizational level digital implementation within Volker Westfalls, which is a little bit different to solving for a tramway or a hospital at the project level. So I think that variety as well is one of the sources for variance. And I think, look, speak to a couple edges other people put up. I think we will see some more transformative and seriously impactful numbers in certain very specific verticals as we move forward as an industry. There are some really, really interesting examples of application of data science in very small areas that might give a big number. But I think Chelsea's spoken to the high level there. I think we're always going to see variety in this space. Just to speak to the second half of the question, are there lessons learned? I think absolutely. And I think, look, credit to all the organizations that have supported this. This report also forms a bit of a record of their achievements, and absolutely dig into the case studies, look for opportunities to learn. And there's already been some comments there about CPS looking to hopefully take this forward. I think I would absolutely, as a practitioner, look at this report and look for ideas to steal, because it's a great showcase for some really impressive organizations and how they're implementing IM.
I think I'll just add on the lessons learned point, Ron. I guess it's sort of maybe an obvious one is just about there's a key lesson learned about having an outcome focus right at the start. I think not so much in kind of what's driving differences between the 1.6%, etc., but actually just in terms of thinking about that broad suite of value right at the outset when you're thinking about the role of IM and the value it can drive and looking across the asset life cycle. I think so it was really, you know, we got so much from the case studies, and just thanks again to everyone on this call. But sometimes that was a learning as stakeholders went along in the process, and more kind of areas of benefit being identified over the time rather than that outcome focus at the start.
Thanks, Chelsea. No, music to my ears. I'm going to attempt something I'm almost definitely going to fail at. So we're coming towards the end of the session. What I want to try and do is for each of the panel members just to maybe give a couple of sentences, really wrap up in terms of what you want to see next. So quite clearly from listening to everybody today, this is just a start or the continuation certainly of a movement. We're all very pleased with the direction we're going in, but you know, what do we really need to focus on next? So from my perspective, not to steal anyone's thunder, you know, that SME point I think is ringing true in my head. Because you know we're all part of large organisations, and you know we need to make sure we're representing that long tail, as said. But I'm going to go down you each in the same order again. If you could give me a sort of a final point in terms of call to action, that would be fantastic. So I'm going to start with you, Richard Threlfall.
To me, it's all about the dissemination, not just to my earlier point outside of the UK and globally, but also how do we make sure this is brought to the attention of those who don't necessarily sit within the fraternity of the sort of digital in infrastructure conversation, but gets to those who are responsible for the businesses and parts of government that can really start to embed this approach in the way we operate.
Yeah, really solid point. Richard Robinson.
Thanks, Ron. I think I'd like the, let's call it the 600% return for investing in IM to become something that's on the tip of everyone's tongue, and that becomes a real recognised stat in the industry. Because that's a tremendous statistic, and it would, as I spoke about in my opener, it would encourage any company to want to invest more in digital transformation, information management. And then I'd also like to see going forward that strengthened IM mandate from the government, if you like, that evolves the BIM mandate to be fit for 2020s.
Absolutely, and fingers crossed on that one, hopefully. Keith.
Yeah, we've got an industry panel here, you know, and I'd really like the findings of this report to be central to policy. So I want to see it embedded in how we deliver the construction playbook. I want to see it central to transforming infrastructure performance. I want Anne-Marie Trevelyan to know about it. I want Paul Scully to be having actions around how we adapt for small businesses. Let's make it, you know, not just about industry talking. We all agree, we're all evangelists for this. How do we get government to act on it as well alongside us?
Yep, fair point. Alexandra.
I'd like to see this unlock not just information management and not just the technical piece behind it, but the whole of the digital transformation agenda as a socio-technical program, and that this is the great starter to show that it is worth it. It's worth it financially, and it's worth it for those intangibles. And let's do that work for the broader digital transformation as well.
Thanks, Alexandra. And Noble.
Just finally, I'd just like to say getting it through to SMEs is the most important point for me, given how difficult it will be. Two-pronged attack. Key highlights of this going directly to SMEs, potentially through the trade associations that represent them, given that most SMEs aren't aware of this type of research, but would actually benefit most from it. They are purely focused on the day-to-day, and they don't have the finance available to invest in areas that would benefit from fully embedding information management, and then getting it through to SMEs indirectly through main contractors and main house builders, because they can, firstly, they're the ones who subcontract out the work to SMEs, but also they're the ones who would know more about it than the SMEs, so they can actually show them the practical benefits as well as the case studies that are there, so can bring them along the journey.
Thanks, Noble. And slightly over time, so apologies for that, but just echoing the point that Neil and Chelsea's just backed up in the chat. Thanks for all of those that contributed to this work. It wouldn't have been a success without those case studies. So really big thanks to all of us on here. And thanks today to all the panelists and to Chelsea and Will too. And I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Good to see you. Bye now.